and then kind of aligning every individual with that mission and making sure they really clearly understand, okay, you're working on this project. Why this project? We're not just saying, hey, Bob, go build this widget over here. We're trying to really empower people to own that work and say, okay, I understand the problem we're solving. I understand how that ladders up to what we're trying to create for our customers, and then also how creating that for our customers ultimately also kind of creates value for the company.
I'm Doug.
I'm Una.
That was Chris Coffey.
And this is our podcast,
Amazing Teams. Join us as we have conversations with remarkable people who are building amazing teams. Chris Coffey, welcome to the Amazing Teams podcast.
Happy to be here.
Chris is the head of engineering at CollegeVine, which is a networking platform for connecting high school students with colleges and advisors. Chris, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
I've been in startups for, I don't know, over a decade at this point, kind of actually started my career in finance, came out of school, studied economics, self-taught programmer along the way, bounced through kind of every part of the hedge fund trading ecosystem you can imagine, got a little burnt out in that world, went over for some reason figuring it'd be smoother and more fun in startup world. It's also crazy, but I kind of fell in love with it. Over the past 12 years or so, I've been doing like progressively earlier and earlier stage companies. So I actually joined CollegeVine as the second employee back when we were at the four founders, an engineer in Zimbabwe, and myself. And we were kind of in like a borrowed conference room from a venture capital firm we were working with at the time. And 8 years later, here I am.
Chris, probably all of our listeners are going to be wondering about one question, which is, what's your favorite taco flavor?
I'm a big fan of barbacoa tacos,
Good
soft
choice.
shell. So just, corn tortilla. It's
Love
delicious.
it. On LinkedIn, you share a link to a guide on working with you. It covers things like how you work, what you value, and some of your mental models. I found it really interesting, and I'm impressed with how in tune you are with how you operate. And I'm just curious, like, what inspired you to create that? And is it working with your team?
Great question. So I first kind of ran into this actually. I had a mentor years ago who'd kind of come out of the big tech world. And he had written a manager read me. And I was like, oh, this is like a really interesting document. I'm learning things about you and kind of what it might be like and how I can work well with you. And one of the things that really jumped out to me when I was reading his was he had the section at the bottom, which was kind of like things to watch out for, like my biases, like things that I'm working on. And so I kept that in the back of my mind for a while. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I sort of revisited the idea. I started reading about it a lot more. There are a lot of folks coming out of Stripe and other companies where this is a bit more common. Decided, all right, I want to sit down and like, given that my team is growing, we're moving really quickly, I want to make sure that really as honestly, like kind of like a recruiting tool to help people understand like, hey, we're a very specific organization. Make sure you know who we are. And I want to give you as much information as I can. So I sat down and over the course of a couple of weeks, like really tried to get as much of what I actually really believe working with me is like down on paper. And then there's this whole round of feedback sharing with my team to make sure, hey guys, does this actually check out with like your lived experience of working with me? So the document that's there, I think it does pretty accurately represent kind of how I try to operate.
Is it a living document? Do you continue adding to it?
It is, but it's one of those things where thankfully updates to it are fairly infrequent. If it were like rapidly changing, that might be a problem. So I'm really trying to hit on the values and philosophies that kind of drive me. And those things are pretty foundational.
Doug and I came across it and we slacked each other and I said, did you see this? This is a treasure trove right there. Our whole conversation is going to be asking all these questions because it's so thoughtful and so insightful. And I was curious, it's really cool. There's a lot of content. Which part of it or which pieces of information do you find to be most helpful when you're working with your team?
That's an interesting question because there's no one size fits all answer to that. It really is. And you'll find probably a lot of my answers in this conversation. So much depends on the context and kind of who the other person in that conversation or people in that conversation are. I'd say with my direct team, I think the most important piece is really the section around my expectations, where I'm trying to make it very clear, here's what I expect from you. Here's how you can work really well with me. and then also here are the behaviors and patterns that don't really work for me. And I find that pretty leveraging. It starts a lot of good conversations with folks when we talk through those things. But say it's somebody on a peer team, I think for them, the one of the most valuable pieces is just that orientation for, okay, who is this Chris guy? Like, what does he actually do at CollegeVine, right? And so that explanation of what I see my role as and kind of what my primary responsibilities are, I think is very useful because it kind of reframes the conversation from, oh, Chris is not like the guy that knows every single thing about every line of code in the system. His job is to make sure the engineering team are able to be super effective. So it changes the kinds of conversations that I'm able to have with folks.
Do other people on your team have something like this? A document that explains how they work and what they
They
like?
they do, yeah. There are a number of people at CollegeVine in kind of leadership roles that have these, and not necessarily management roles. So in my org, there's a bunch of folks that are what I call like engineering leads or kind of like principal engineers, where someone who's like a principal engineer, they're an IC, hands-on in the code, but they're also in a leadership role. People look to them as mentors, guides, kind of they set a lot of the tone in the day-to-day operation of the team. Every one of those folks has a working with me guide. And the expectation is, hey, you're working with someone new joined the company, you're dropping into a new team to support. Like you should drop a link to your working with me into that very early into that relationship, just to help people kind of understand, okay, I'm working with this person and I haven't worked with them before. What should I expect?
I love that. Can you give us an idea of your team size there at CollegeVine?
Yeah, again, the whole company's pretty small. There's about 40 people in the company. My team across IT, security, data engineering, application engineering, it's 14 people.
Gotcha.
So not huge.
Were you on the team that wrote the original code base? Like how
Oh
involved are
yeah.
you? Okay. I'm curious how that transition has gone for you since before the show we were talking about my transition from going from an individual contributor and in the code base to now opening it up. I'm just curious about your transition from being that contributor to more of a leader.
Yeah, no, it's great. So back when we first started working on this system, there were four other engineers, myself, someone who's kind of my boss, Mohan, who's now our COO. He was the CTO at the time. So he was sort of 25% in the code. I was very heavily involved in building the system and kind of managing the rest of the engineers. But when you go from four, a couple of years later, we were up to nearly 20 engineers. We've kind of bounced around in size a little bit. I can't be as involved in that code. So there was absolutely this process of moving from kind of measuring and considering a lot of my contributions to be in that like lead architect kind of lead engineer mold where I was in there, I was designing features, I was dropping into teams to help build gnarly bits of the system, to stepping back and saying, well, okay, we need a thing to do this. And so there was this change, and it took many, many months of kind of recasting the way that when I look at how do I contribute? How do I create value? Like how do I measure, did I have a good productive day? And for so much of my career, that was, well, did I build and ship code that worked and solved problems for our users? And I had to kind of shift that to, well, did I have a team that did that? Was my team unblocked? Did they understand what they were working on? And so it was a very different set of feedback loops I had to kind of build for myself. It took a long time to put that together.
What did that feel like? I'm assuming it might have been a hard transition in the beginning.
Yeah, it was a really hard transition because, and I mean, Doug, I think you probably know this, but I'm not aware of many other fields that have such a tight, immediate feedback loop between what you're doing and kind of getting that immediate, like it worked, it didn't, it was successful. When I'm writing software, great. I write some tests and maybe the tests pass, the compiler passes, my code ships to production, great. And all of that's, I'm getting that feedback within a matter of seconds from I do something to I see the result. When in kind of that shift to really focusing on the people and the team, the feedback cycles might be months before I really understand, oh, I'm going to move this engineer over to this other team. That new team is going to take months to gel. And so was that a good decision or not is really hard to stay on top of and kind of keep track of. And so unwinding that immediacy of the feedback, that took a lot. And it took a lot of building in like smaller checkpoints along the way to kind of give myself some semblance of a quick feedback.
I'm curious about this part where you say, you move someone over to another team and the team gels. That's the phrase you used. So I'm curious, how do you know that the team gels? Like that's kind of, the amazing teams. How do you know that it's gelling? And what are maybe some of those checkpoints that show it's working, it's not working?
Yeah, a lot of the checkpoints are early on are qualitative. Because again, like sometimes, in a company like CollegeVine, where a lot of the core team have been together for a long time, there is a lot of fluidity. There's a lot of strong working relationships. Even if people aren't directly working on a project together, they worked on a project 18 months ago for a few months and they know how to work together. But sometimes, you bring new folks in or people move into new roles and that changes. And so it's not like, I take someone, I put them in a new team and the team just magically gels. There's a lot that goes into making sure that that team early on, I guess, to increase the probability of the gel, trying to get them a lot of quick wins. So how do we, you don't want to I don't want to take a bunch of people, put them on an ambiguous, hard problem, and they've never worked together. Because not only is there essential complexity in this hard problem they're trying to solve that is stressful, but they also don't know how to work together. They don't know how to communicate with each other. They don't have that kind of shared trust in understanding who's going to pick up which pieces of it effectively. So trying to start a fresh team with a simpler set of wins and milestones, right? Like rather than solve the whole problem, just come to a clear definition on the problem, right? That's a win. Then what's that next step? Like unlock that. So try to really make it incremental and sequential as opposed to like a big meaty thing they need to take down. And then checking in with folks all the time. How's this working? Getting feedback, not only from the folks on my team, how's it working, but also the other people in that team, grabbing a few minutes saying, hey, how's it working with Alice? Like what's working, what's not? And then one of the things I do is we're small enough that I can still drop into a lot of the stand-up meetings. So I'll just kind of pop in and I'll just hang out. And I'll say, I'm just here. I'm really just looking at the dynamic in those conversations. Is there tension? Are people chiming in to kind of help each other? Sort of how does it feel? And I know that's kind of a squishy answer, but
I love that. How would you describe your leadership style?
I'm going to indirectly answer this question. I think my responsibility is to make sure the people on my team have the tools and information they need to do a really good job. Part of that is we try to hire really exceptional, talented people. And I want to make sure that they're pointed in the right direction and that there are, again, I've talked about feedback loops a few times here, that they're kind of like guardrails or feedback loops to make sure that they continue going in what we've agreed is the right direction. After that, I kind of need to get out of the way. I'll check in to make sure, hey, did anything unexpected come up? But I'm kind of looking at a lot of the support systems around to make sure, okay, things are shipping properly, they're still reliable, our unit tests are all continuing to pass the right rate, CI is taking the right amount of time, et cetera. We're getting good feedback from how the product's being received. And so long as those things are green, and my job is kind of just to stay out of their way. So, which is not to say that I'm not paying attention to what's happening, but I never want my feedback or my input to block their ability to do their job.
Chris, I was curious about sharing feedback. So in your guide, you said you try not to buffer up feedback until the one-on-one you have with people on your team, and you'd rather give it to them at the time that something was to happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
You mostly work remotely.
Yep.
How do you give people feedback in the moment in a remote world?
Well, I'll kind of share a kind of example. So every 2 weeks we have a demo day, and a lot of engineers demo pieces of software. It might be a new feature we shipped. It might be some performance improvement, whatever it might be, but they're getting up in front of the company on a screen share and they're kind of walking through the product, kind of whatever changes they made. I'll be taking notes, not necessarily about the product, but I'll be taking notes about how was it delivered? How are the questions? Kind of how was their pacing? All these kinds of things. And then I want to, at the end of it, I try to make sure that I'm giving them, okay, here's what went really well. Here's some areas that didn't go well. So it's maybe you had great pacing, you talked through the product really well, but you didn't actually contextualize why we built the thing and the problem it solved for our customers. So next time you need to lead with that and then run through what you did. Or it might be you did a great job contextualizing, but then you went really fast when you were actually showing the product. Take more time to really demonstrate. It'll help people understand how this thing is solving the problem you described earlier. So, and I'll do that for something like that where it's fairly technical feedback, if you will. I'll usually give them just a direct Slack message afterwards. If it's a little more involved or maybe behavioral, I'll usually say, hey, can we just hop on a quick call? And I'll talk them through kind of what I observed. And we'll have more of a conversation about it. But for, say, like critical feedback like that, I'm always delivering that kind of one-on-one out of that. But if someone just does a great job It's the inverse. I'll drop a public message we have a celebrations channel, and I'll drop a message in there, and I'll try to really clearly articulate not only like, hey, great job on this thing, but then the specific behaviors or things that they did that I think were really great. And I do that because I actually want that to reinforce those behaviors for the rest of the company to see that like these are the kinds of things that we really value in our organization. And so when you see someone else getting praised for that, hopefully you start kind of trying to embody that a little bit more as well.
Sounds like you have a very strong feedback culture there at CollegeVine.
We do, yeah. It's something we coach kind of the management team on, but then I also give a lot of feedback to, I mentioned kind of the people in leadership, not necessarily management roles, feedback to them as well, trying to make sure that, hey, people do look up to you, and basically anybody can definitely give praise or feedback to anybody else, but trying to make sure that especially the people who are looked to as leaders are constantly giving feedback on what's working, what's not.
Yeah. Feedback is such an important part of helping people in unlocking their full potential. Any other things come to your mind when you think of unlocking somebody to do their best work?
There's a whole laundry list of things here. I think feedback is a really important tool, but I think the foundation for it, from my experience, is making sure that people have really clear expectations for what they need to be doing. And I mean, for us, that starts in the first call when we're interviewing a new candidate, and we continue coaching and kind of drilling that basically the entire time somebody is at the company. We have, for every role at the company, we have a scorecard that actually lays out, these are the outcomes that we would expect for you. These are the kinds of behaviors that we're expecting someone in this role to really embody when they're doing a great job in that role. And we'll share that scorecard with candidates kind of after they've passed the interview process, but before they sign the offer, to say, hey, just to triple check here, this is what you're signing up for. Does this sound like something you want to do? On top, so kind of assuming you have like clear expectations, the next most important piece is making sure that there's also like a really shared understanding of the mission we're going after as a company, and then kind of aligning every individual with that mission and making sure they really clearly understand, okay, you're working on this project. Why this project? We're not just saying, hey, Bob, go build this widget over here. We're trying to really empower people to own that work and say, okay, I understand the problem we're solving. I understand how that ladders up to what we're trying to create for our customers, and then also how creating that for our customers ultimately also kind of creates value for the company as well. And when we do that, and we do that effectively, we use this phrase internally, like acting like an owner. It pushes a lot of the decision making down to like the leaf nodes in an organization, and that in turn lets the organization actually go a lot faster. Because if you have people, kind of engineers, is what I think about all day long. I know you have a design background, Doug. I'm sure you're used to the cases where you design something, an engineer's working to build it, and there's a lot of questions. Hey, how should this work? How should this work? What about this? And there's a lot of like back and forth over time to try and get that. What we try to do to really make people be effective and kind of maximize their potential is see the design and take that design as, okay, this is what it should look like, but really also understanding why this design, what is this design solving for? And then kind of allowing them to use their judgment to a large degree on, okay, it turns out this aspect of it is actually maybe much more expensive than we thought it would be, given the holistic design we're trying to solve for here. I'm actually going to solve that problem a slightly different way. And so allowing the engineer to kind of make those decisions on the margin and then say, hey, by the way, I did this thing. We can change it if we need to, but I did it because it does seem to still kind of line up with the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish here. And so when that's happening, people both have a lot more agency in what they're doing. And they also tend to, by virtue of not having a lot of those kind of back and forth question, answer, looking to somebody else to solve their problem, they're actually able to move a lot more quickly as well.
Chris, question about that ownership mentality. I really like what you wrote in your file about you expect people to be like owners. Do you think that's something that people come with in a sense of it's an attitude people have or mindset? Or do you think the way you push decision-making down to people doing the work helps build that mindset, or both?
It's probably a skill more than anything else. There are some people who definitely come into the company with more of an ownership mindset, but that often seems to be kind of just a result of like their prior experiences. So say that somebody has been at 3 other small startups. Okay, that person has worn a lot of hats. They have been thrown into a lot of, hey, we need to solve this specific problem in this really tight window. So they've done that. They've kind of had to own problems like that before. But, we've also seen a lot of folks come in from big tech and acquire and learn those skills and get really good at thinking about the business problem and understanding like what's the essence we have to solve for the business and our customer. And maybe these other pieces we can actually cut off and address later or solve in a different way. Yeah, I think it's a blend. Like people might come in with it, but it's not like a innate thing you have or don't have. It's a skill that you can develop and practice.
So we have to ask, since our podcast is called Amazing Teams Podcast, when you hear the phrase amazing team, what comes to mind?
I thought about this a little bit. I think when I'm thinking about an amazing team, it's a team that is consistently able to kind of accomplish their objectives and maybe more than you thought that they would be able to without burning themselves down or like breaking, right? Because you can imagine situations where you have a team that, they're pretty effective. They just grind and grind and they work enormous amounts of overtime and we shipped way more. We delivered way more than we thought we could. But then the team just breaks down and falls apart afterwards because they pushed too hard. I think an amazing team is one where they have the self-awareness to understand where their limits as a team are, but then they're also able to really support and complement each other to a degree where the sum of those individuals is far more effective than any kind of drop a couple people off and maybe the efficacy of that team dramatically changes. So it's kind of this like together that group have learned how to deliver outsized returns relative to what you might expect.
Yeah, there's no wrong or right answers to that question, but that sure sounds like a right answer.
How important do you think relationships between people are for building such a team? Right? Like we have competency, we have skill, we know what we're doing. Do we like each other? Do we pass the beer test?
Yeah, that's a great one. I don't think people on an amazing team have to be friends. I don't think they have to go hang out with each other after work. I do think there has to be a really high level of mutual respect. I think people have to really trust each other. And I think they have to really believe that everybody else on the team is trying to do their best work. So this kind of sense of people have to be very charitable and they have to really be putting effort into that team and believing that other people are doing the same. They could have very different lives outside of work. They could have very different interests and they don't necessarily have to like want to hang out with each other afterwards, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I listened to a podcast recently with Doug Leone, who was one of the partners at, I think it's Sequoia. And he talked about his late partner, there were two managing partners at the time. And he said, we were so different, had nothing in common between 5 p.m. and 9 a.m. But between 9 and 5, the level of mutual respect and trust and understanding off the charts. And I just thought that was so interesting. I always lean towards we have to, get each other and have good relationships, but clearly there's a balance. You don't have to do that. There's too little and there's too much in either case, right? There has to be a balance.
Yep. Yeah.
But what you just said reminded me of that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton to that, right? Like the common adage, like being very careful about starting a startup with your best friend or something like that. Because they're definitely, if you're, and I've been there, right? Like when you're too close to the people you're working with, it can actually be difficult to give them some of the feedback or make some of the decisions you need to make. And so kind of finding that balance to kind of what you were just saying, is really important. And it's probably going to be very different depending on the organization, like what that expectation is and what people are expecting from being a part of that organization as well.
Love it. How about a personal story of success where you help unlock somebody at CollegeVine?
Okay, yeah. So this is a long running kind of story. It's not like a single moment, but like I said, kind of a few minutes ago, the core of the team have been together for a long time. And we put a lot of effort into hiring really excellent, talented engineers. But I'm also going to talk about how a lot of people come in with very different skill sets and very different perspectives. And so there's an engineer on the team, one of our principal engineers, who has always been an excellent, very strong engineer. But when he was kind of first started working with us, and for a while, there was like a slightly different, what was valued and kind of the ability, given a hard technical problem versus given a hard business problem, and the ability to think really critically about the business problem itself. That wasn't a skill that he'd had as much practice with. Give him hey, we need to implement this really complex UI that has all these different behaviors, knocks it out of the park, no problem. And so over the past, couple of years working together with him, we've been working, we've been really focusing on how to think more and more critically about the business problems and how to really cut to the essence of what matters, what doesn't, what do we need to solve for here? How do we get feedback on our solutions and kind of really always focusing on kind of pulling value earlier and getting that feedback both from the business and our customers. And there was this moment, kind of I wouldn't say the culmination because you're never done, but a really great moment for me recently was, so he's recently been dropped into and working with a totally different team on our go-to-market side. And we haven't really had a lot of engineering support over there before. And I got this piece of feedback from kind of the leader over there saying, hey, I just want to say how happy I am to have this guy over here. It's been exceptional working with him. He's been doing such a great job tackling kind of the business problems and always keeping that top of mind with everything that he's doing with us. And so for me, just kind of like seeing that and bearing that in mind and kind of that growth that he's been able to have over his years with us to get from where it was maybe a little risky to give him just an ambiguous business problem to now he's the only engineer over in an area that hasn't had that support at all. And all the problems are ambiguous business problems. And to get this feedback that he's doing an exceptionally good job there that's awesome.
That is awesome. This is a little self-serving, but as you know, we're growing the dev team here at Hey Taco. Any words of advice for me stepping into this position of managing developers? I'm new at this. I have no idea what I'm doing. So anything you have to say is very much appreciated.
Awesome. Ooh, where to start?
Don't hold back, Chris. Just go ahead.
I think engineering management is hard. One of the things I've found to be really, really useful, and I've talked about feedback loops a few times now. Think about early on building in at least the ability to measure and understand the different dimensions of the engineering process itself that matters. So I put a lot of energy and kind of culturally, it started in engineering, but it's actually now something we do sort of across the company, into really focusing on keeping like the batch size for work very small and trying to have rapid cycle times. That is more from experience, where in the past, I and most other software engineers have worked on those projects that just keep taking a little longer and you're perpetually 90% done, right? And that's a nightmare. That's every business's nightmare because you're not realizing the value because maybe the way it was sequenced to actually deliver it. Oh, well, now you actually have to commit to all of this and you're 50% over budget, et cetera. I guess what I'd say there is even early on, even if it's just in a spreadsheet, like pay attention to how big are the chunks of work that we're taking on? Do they have to be that big? Can we make them a little smaller and do more chunks? It's strictly less efficient in terms of like the developer's energy, but you're doing it in pieces and you're able to learn from each of those pieces along the way. Mm-hmm. And by virtue of cutting that big thing up into little pieces, you've decomposed this potentially big, like it might take me 2 weeks to build that. Well, maybe you've decomposed it into 5 or 6 things. Okay, this could take me a day and a half. This could take me 4 hours. This one might take 2 days. Now you have a much better sense for like where some of that risk is. And you're much able to understand how are we progressing against our original kind of, it's about 2 weeks to do this thing.
That sounds a lot like the quick wins about putting a team together, right? Like creating those opportunities for team to have a quick win, individuals and teams as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, pretty much every scorecard that I mentioned earlier in my organization, one of the objectives for it is the ability to consistently deliver any individual task that you start, not necessarily the whole feature, but any individual task in 2 days or less. And then there's a bunch of infrastructure that we've kind of had put in place on the engineering side to do that, right? Like we run continuous integration and continuous deployment. So you merge your code, it's go to master. That kind of once it passes our tests, that's essential. We make really heavy use of feature flags. That's pretty standard practice these days. But again, that allows you to, when you have these like partially finished features, great. You just hide the whole thing behind a feature flag until it's all ready or until the essential pieces are ready. But you're able to ship it to production and you're able to get the cycles. Okay, we know we didn't crash anything. We know we didn't break anything by shipping these pieces up to that point. And that's great. That increases your confidence that what you're shipping is actually correct and is going to work.
I want to toe the buzzword line here and talk about engagement. Feedback, I don't know if we can really attribute that to an engaged person. What type of things do you see, or the attributes do you see of a person who is really engaged in their work?
This is kind of a squishy attribute, but somebody who really is aligned with the mission they're trying to solve. Right? Like somebody who is really bought into not only like build this thing, but why we're building it.
Mhm.
And that kind of resonates with them. I think that, and again, that's more of a thing that really drives engagement. I think the other piece is that sense of kind of the quick wins, right? Like when someone is consistently getting wins, that's a nice positive feedback loop. And when they feel that they have the freedom and flexibility to more or less do that work how they want, that's again kind of another multiplier on there. So it's kind of, I think it's a bunch of these things you kind of like take together, and you know, you want to get feedback from people on, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? The absence of any of those like can work for a while, but I think it ultimately ends up dragging down their engagement over time.
As you know, we mentioned we're building out this team, and we had a developer a few weeks ago that we shared numbers with, and he was working on a feature, and we basically said, hey, you know, this feature could do this to the bottom line. And I felt like level 2 of engagement was unlocked, right? I saw him go back to his desk and he was like smile on his face. He felt like he now knew what he was working on and how it was really impacting the business. And I kind of felt like, oh, wow, that's incredible what just happened.
Yeah, it's exactly that, right? Like when people, and you just experience this, when folks, myself included, like understand why we're doing this and what delivering something or building something unlocks, not only necessarily just for the company's bottom line,
Mm-hmm.
but also for your users. That immediately helps contextualize everything else that they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like how does this improve the customer's
Right.
experience, right? That's just as valuable as adding $10 to the bottom line, right? Sometimes
Right.
it's even more valuable.
How do you
Yeah.
observe engagement, Chris? You know, we work a lot with HR leaders, and one of the metrics that they look at is communication in public channels, right? It's a lot very lagging, but people might say no one's talking to each other necessarily in our remote office. How do you
Mhm.
know when someone's has the autonomy, the purpose of what they're doing, and they feel like I'm bought in, I know I'm an owner of this company, the way I work?
So tracking public communication, yeah, that makes sense. We actually do look at that on like an aggregate level for the company. I'd say for myself and with my direct team, it's actually more on a qualitative kind of one-on-one basis. So despite having other managers underneath me who manage a big chunk of the team, I still carry kind of infrequent skip conversations with everybody. And just kind of checking in, picking their brains, seeing what they're thinking about, kind of how they're feeling about stuff really helps. I also, just like a lot of HR leaders do, I periodically survey my team and try and get a sense for a whole bunch of different dimensions that I think contribute to their ability to be effective, to kind of care about what they're doing. Right? Like I ask them, do you understand why you're like the roadmap and why you're working on the things you're working on, and how our industry works and what our customers need and how they use the product and all these kinds of things. And that stuff then factors into, well, okay, how do I shift training? How do I kind of drive more conversations with customers or whatever it might be? But on a one-on-one basis, kind of go back to your original question, you know, I mean, I guess that is kind of how I address it. It's very qualitative, I just ask.
Mhm.
And again, I mentioned I'm popping into to stand-up conversations as well. So I'm collecting that kind of weak signal again, like, okay, is somebody during stand-up, are they kind of looking off somewhere else the whole time? Are they like doing something else? Are they checked out? Are they listening in and kind of chiming in with maybe answers to something else? Maybe someone else is blocked on something. Maybe they have an idea. Are they chiming in right there? Or are they elsewhere mentally? And those are all things that I kind of listen and kind of pay attention to as well.
This leads me into a topic I'd love to hear what you think on, but you said in your folder, again, how if someone's not happy or not getting the value out of their work, they should come talk to you and see
Mhm.
if there's a way to reorient their work, get development to
Mhm.
stay at CollegeVine and have
Yeah.
have a fun time. That's very open. People don't usually say, hey, come talk to me when you want to leave. And people don't usually come talk to their boss when they want to leave.
Yep.
Since you have publicly declared that, how has that worked? Have you had people come to you and say, hey, Chris, I think I'm going to go? And what happens then?
Yeah, I have. I have had that happen. I will say, you know, not everybody does that, but I have had folks come to me and say that, and you get curious. You try to understand, okay, tell me more. Like help me understand what's not working for you. What do you feel you need? Like where's the delta here? And we can't always make it work, but you know, maybe someone's saying, hey, like I'm just feeling really bored in this part of the product. I've been over working on this for a long time. Like it's just not working for me. I think I'm kind of looking for a new challenge. thanks for talking to me. We have challenges. So maybe that's like a pretty easy thing for us to shift over. But yeah, I mean, and again, there has to be a really high degree of like psychological safety and mutual trust for that to happen. But yeah, when it does happen, they tend to be actually really great conversations.
And so probably if they end up staying, now you have jumped to a level of trust that you never had before, right? It sounds like it was an opportunity to even deepen that relationship with that person.
Yeah, to a large degree it is.
Very cool. As you know, Chris, with Hey Taco, you have 5 tacos to give each day to help you share gratitude. Who would you like to give your 5 tacos to today?
That's a fun one. I'd give each of you a taco. Appreciate you all having me on. It's a lot of fun to nerd out about leadership and amazing teams. Yeah, I think my other 3 tacos probably going to go to my family, right? Like we've been talking a lot about work, but there's this whole other piece, and we kind of like didn't really touch on it when we're talking about the difficulty of transitioning from like an IC role to a management role. But there's a lot of support systems that I kind of had to think through and help like build and change outside of work, just to make sure that you can, from 9 to 5, go really hard and be really focused. And so, yeah, I'd give the other tacos to my family.
Is there enough for each of one?
There is, yes. Yep. Everyone gets one.
Love it. Chris, thank you for being on the podcast. We'll include a link to your guide in the show notes. And where can people go to learn more about you and CollegeVine?
Yeah, so probably the best place to learn about us would be teamcanopy.com. Otherwise, yeah, check out collegevine.com. That's our actual product. You're welcome to go play around with that. And as for learning about me, yeah, honestly, that management readme you guys have been mentioning, that's the place.
We will definitely include that in the show notes. And Chris, just before we jump off, I have 2 tacos to give. One to you guys for recently getting SOC 2 certified, which is no small feat. So I just wanted to highlight that for anyone listening. And I think my second taco goes to Aaron Core-Miller, who introduced us and is the reason why we're talking today. So I appreciate Aaron.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron, if you're listening.
Awesome.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Take care.
What did you learn as a result of this conversation from Chris that you think you're going to start doing?
Yeah, I love Chris's awareness around how he operates. And I think that I could do some discovery into how I operate and try to articulate it into a document that others can view and read and learn. And I think that from it, it's going to, well, one, it's going to help me understand myself a little better and how I work. But also, I think it's going to give people the opportunity to kind of read how I work, but also test me, right? Because I think sometimes I need to be tested, right? I think sometimes I believe I am a certain way, but then something happens and I realize, wow, that's not who I am. And so I think finding that awareness and understanding in myself within a team is really important. And I think I can do a better job at that. So Chris has really inspired me around that.
One thing that is, I think, new for you with more people on the team is that the impact that what you do has on other people. It's kind of like having kids, right? Like they are sponges and they follow you and they absorb you and what you do. So the things that you say, that you do and whatnot, like people, they not might be conscious of it, but it sets a precedent to like, this is what we're about, right? So I think intentionality is even more important now than it was with just the 2 of us, right? Or even just you, clearly.
Yeah. I really like how intentional Chris is with feedback, right? I feel like everything he does, he's looking for some form of feedback. And I think that's super impactful in, well, one, fostering deeper relationships with people, right? The more feedback you have, and that's good feedback, constructive feedback, bad feedback, however you want to describe it. I think feedback in general is just so good. And the faster you can get that feedback, I think the faster we all can improve. And so I was really inspired by how much Chris really strives to pull feedback out of everything that they do at CollegeVine.
I think we should start very small, like ending our meetings with a small section of feedback. How did this meeting go? What can we do better? Right? It starts in the small, because if we wait for an end of a large project to give feedback, we're behind the ball. I like your idea of small win, and a lot of what we do is uncertain, right? There's only so much that is defined in what we do because our business is not very reactive and manual, right? So it's not very administrative. Like there's jobs that are very like processing stuff. We don't do that necessarily. A lot of it is building new things that we don't know what the end looks like necessarily. Or maybe we know what the end looks like, we don't know how to get there. So breaking things into smaller chunks. So even with the single platform, even with the first project of people can sign into the website with Microsoft Teams, there could be 15 steps. The first one could be research authentication technology using Microsoft Teams. I don't even know, I'm spitballing, right? But how do we break it down into such small chunks that decrease that uncertainty and create like a quick win? Yeah, I just spent an hour doing this and I feel accomplished. I've made progress. Otherwise, it might feel like this giant project that no one knows what to do. And then we just kind of give up.
Yeah, very true. I do like that.
I also love how he said when new people join, or if someone is having a meeting with someone they haven't had before, they'll send them the About Me page. So you can look into it before you jump into a call with someone you've never met. And you all of a sudden understand so much more about them that you wouldn't have known otherwise.
Hey, thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, then please share this podcast with others. And we would love to know how we did. You can tell us by going to amazingteams.com/feedback.